Black hair. Black hair represents the highest concentration of pheomelanin in the human spectrum. It is the most common natural hair color globally, found predominantly in populations from Africa, East and Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, and indigenous groups of the Americas. Structurally, black hair often has thicker strands with a more elliptical or flattened cross-section, contributing to natural curl or coarseness depending on the region. This dense pigmentation acts as a biological shield, protecting the scalp from ultraviolet damage and helping retain moisture in hot climates. In equatorial and tropical regions, this was not merely aesthetic, it was an adaptive trait. The heavy eumelanin content prevented hair from becoming brittle under constant sun exposure and provided thermal regulation by absorbing and redistributing heat evenly. In many African populations, the tightly coiled shape of black hair further amplified this advantage. The coils created air pockets that insulated the head and reduced direct sun contact with the scalp. East Asian black hair, by contrast, tends to be straight and cylindrical. The strands contain a similar amount of eumelanin but differ in structure, thicker, denser, and more uniform. This form evolved to protect against cold and wind rather than heat. The smooth, thick strands retained warmth during colder seasons, an advantage in the temperate climates of East Asia and Siberia. Over evolutionary history, black hair's endurance and UV resistance made it the baseline phenotype from which lighter colors eventually diverged. Every other hair color represents a genetic variation that slightly reduces or alters the function of eumelanin synthesis. Dark brown hair. Dark brown hair evolved as the first major variation from black hair. It retains a high concentration of eumelanin, but in a slightly reduced amount, giving it a warmer tone that reflects light more readily. This color became prevalent in populations living in regions where sunlight was strong but not unrelenting year-round, such as parts of South Asia, the Middle East, Southern Europe, and Latin America. The genetic difference lies in minor mutations of the MC1R and OCA2 genes, which regulate the amount and distribution of melanin in the follicle. The moderate eumelanin level of dark brown hair allowed populations to maintain adequate protection from ultraviolet radiation while increasing the efficiency of vitamin D absorption in milder climates. Structurally, dark brown hair tends to have strands that are thick but slightly less rigid than those found in black hair. The shape of the strand can vary from straight to wavy, reflecting adaptations to humidity and temperature. In Mediterranean and Middle Eastern environments, this waviness helped manage heat dissipation by allowing airflow between strands while still shading the scalp. Dark brown hair's advantage lay in balance. It maintained strong UV resistance without completely blocking solar radiation needed for nutrient production. This made it one of the most evolutionarily stable hair types, one capable of thriving across climates with moderate solar exposure. Over generations, it became a defining feature of people whose ancestors lived in transitional zones between the tropics and temperate regions. Medium brown hair. Medium brown hair represents a further dilution of eumelanin. The pigment density is reduced enough for individual strands to appear lighter under direct light but still deep enough to provide some sun protection. This color became widespread in Central and Eastern Europe, parts of the Middle East, and temperate Asia, where sunlight was less intense and seasons were distinctly variable. With less eumelanin, the follicles required fewer resources to maintain pigmentation, which may have been a metabolic advantage in cooler climates with limited ultraviolet exposure. The hair strands themselves became finer and lighter, improving insulation by trapping air more effectively, a crucial adaptation during long, cold winters. The soft, flexible structure of medium brown hair also allowed for a wider range of textures, from straight to loose curls, making it an adaptable form suited to both humid summers and freezing winters. From a genetic standpoint, this color often arises from reduced activity in the TRP1 enzyme, a key regulator of melanin production. The result is a subtle lightening effect that retains functional benefits while visually differentiating populations over time. Light brown hair. Light brown hair carries a significantly lower concentration of eumelanin and begins to show small amounts of pheomelanin, the reddish-yellow pigment that adds warmth to the overall tone. This blend produces a golden or honey-brown color, common in Western Europe and mixed heritage populations in the Americas. Evolutionarily, it marks a midpoint between darker hair of tropical ancestry and the lighter shades adapted for northern climates. The advantage of this tone was rooted in flexibility. Populations with light brown hair could live efficiently in environments where sunlight was limited during parts of the year but strong in others. The reduced melanin allowed better vitamin D synthesis during long winters, while the residual pigment still offered moderate UV protection in the summer. Structurally, light brown hair tends to be finer, with a smoother cuticle layer that reflects more light, creating the perception of gloss or brightness. The The transition toward lighter hues also corresponded with changes in dietary and seasonal behavior. As humans moved north and relied less on sun exposure and more on stored or animal-derived vitamin D, pigmentation began to relax. Light brown hair thus symbolizes an evolutionary compromise, retaining warmth and resilience while allowing photochemical efficiency in lower light. Blonde hair. Blonde hair represents one of the most distinctive shifts in human pigmentation. It is characterized by a very low concentration of eumelanin and a variable amount of pheomelanin, which gives it hues ranging from golden to ash or platinum. This hair color first appeared in prehistoric Europe, most notably in regions such as Scandinavia, the Baltic states, and northern Russia, roughly 10,000 to 15,000 years ago, after the last ice age. The reduced sunlight in these high-latitude regions created evolutionary pressure for bodies to absorb as much UV radiation as possible to produce sufficient vitamin D, vital for bone and immune health. The genetic foundation of blonde hair is strongly linked to mutations in the KITL-G and MC1R genes, which reduce the activity of melanocytes within hair follicles. These changes do not eliminate melanin completely, but dramatically limit its production. As a result, blonde hair strands contain fewer pigment granules, and the light passing through them scatters easily, creating their luminous appearance. Structurally, blonde hair is often the finest and most fragile of all hair colors due to its reduced pigment density and thinner strand diameter. This allows it to reflect sunlight efficiently, an optical advantage that may have helped retain warmth and light in cold, dim environments. In evolutionary terms, blonde hair was not purely adaptive in a biological sense. It may have been reinforced through sexual selection. In small, isolated communities of ancient northern Europeans, lighter features stood out visually against the darker background of most early humans, making them novel and potentially more attractive. Over generations, this preference may have increased the frequency of genes associated with light hair. This dual mechanism, environmental adaptation and sexual selection, helped blonde hair persist in populations even after humans developed more complex societies. Golden and strawberry blonde hair. Golden blonde hair includes slightly more pheomelanin than typical ash blonde, creating a warm, sunlit tone. It developed in regions of northern and central Europe where solar intensity varied seasonally. This pigmentation allowed a fine-tuned balance, enough eumelanin to offer mild protection during bright summers, while still maintaining high vitamin D absorption in overcast or winter months. Strawberry blonde hair, a rare subtype, leans further toward pheomelanin, which gives it a copper or reddish tint. Genetically, it often results from heterozygous combinations of the same MC1R variants found in red hair, but mixed with lower eumelanin activity typical of blonde tones. This color emerged naturally in populations where red hair genes diffused into lighter-haired groups through migration or intermarriage. It represents a transitional phenotype, bridging the gap between blonde and red through a delicate balance of both pigment types. Structurally, both golden and strawberry blonde hair tend to be fine and soft, with a smooth cuticle layer that reflects light diffusely. This enhances the visual brightness of the hair, making it appear almost luminous in sunlight. The practical advantage of this lighter tone remained the same: to capture scarce ultraviolet light efficiently and maintain adequate nutrient synthesis in climates where direct sunlight was rare for much of the year. Red hair. Red hair is the rarest natural hair color in the world, appearing in less than 2% of the global population. It is defined by dominance of pheomelanin over eumelanin, which produces shades ranging from bright copper to deep auburn. The origin of red hair is closely associated with mutations in the MC1R gene, most notably the variant R160W, which alters how melanocytes process melanin. Instead of producing the darker eumelanin pigment, the cells shift almost entirely to pheomelanin synthesis. Red hair is thought to have evolved in northwestern Europe, particularly in areas like Scotland, Ireland, and coastal Norway, around the same post-Ice Age period that blonde hair emerged. In these low UV regions, the reduced eumelanin allowed maximum UV absorption, optimizing vitamin D production. However, because pheomelanin is less effective at blocking ultraviolet rays, redheads are more prone to sunburn, a trade-off that mattered little in consistently cloudy environments. Another distinctive feature is the structure of the strand. Red hair fibers are typically thicker in diameter and more rigid, with a higher density of keratin that gives them strength and durability. The pigment granules are larger and more irregular, scattering light in a way that gives the hair its fiery glow. This unique optical property may have served an additional role in thermal regulation, reflecting visible light more effectively to maintain scalp temperature balance in cool climates. Over time, red hair persisted not because it conferred survival advantage, but because of genetic drift and positive mate selection in small populations. Like blonde hair, its rarity made it stand out. In prehistoric groups, visible uniqueness could become a social or reproductive advantage, reinforcing the gene's presence over generations. Light auburn and chestnut hair. Light auburn and chestnut hair represent the intermediate range between red and brown tones, shaped by a complex balance of eumelanin and pheomelanin within each strand. These shades emerged as populations carrying both dark brown and red hair genes mixed over thousands of years, particularly across Western and Central Europe. The result is hair that glows reddish-brown in sunlight yet appears darker indoors, a reflection of how pigment granules are distributed within the cortex of each strand. The evolutionary advantage of auburn and chestnut tones lies in their adaptability to mid-latitude environments. They provide enough eumelanin to shield against ultraviolet radiation during sunny periods, while the increased pheomelanin content enhances the ability to absorb limited sunlight in winter. This blend maintains a stable internal vitamin D cycle without the extreme sensitivity seen in pure red hair. Structurally, chestnut and auburn hair are moderate in thickness, smooth in texture, and often slightly wavy, traits that favor insulation in cooler weather while remaining breathable in milder climates. Genetically, these tones often result from partial expression of the MC1R variant combined with moderate activity in the TYRP1 gene. This creates pigment variation within individual hairs, giving them a multi-dimensional color that shifts under different lighting. Over time, these hybrid tones became common across Europe and Western Asia, tracing ancient patterns of trade and migration that blended genetic traits from north and south. Gray hair. Gray hair does not represent a separate genetic color, but rather a loss of pigment production that occurs naturally with aging. Inside the follicle, specialized cells called melanocyte stem cells gradually deplete over time. Without them, new hair growth contains little or no melanin, resulting in strands that appear gray, silver, or white depending on how much pigment remains. This process typically begins in middle age but can occur earlier depending on genetics, stress, and nutritional factors. From an evolutionary standpoint, gray hair may have had social significance rather than biological advantage. It acted as a visible marker of age and experience, signaling wisdom, authority, or leadership within early human groups. This could have fostered respect or trust for older individuals who possessed vital survival knowledge. Structurally, gray hair tends to become coarser and drier because the loss of pigment affects the follicle's ability to produce natural oils. The medulla, the central core of the hair shaft, often expands slightly, causing the strand to reflect light differently, which gives gray hair its silvery sheen. The onset of graying can also vary by ethnicity. Studies show that East Asian populations tend to gray later than Europeans, while African populations may experience the slowest overall rate of pigment loss. This variation correlates with differences in oxidative stress regulation, where certain populations have stronger antioxidant defenses in hair follicle cells. White hair. White hair occurs when pigment production stops entirely. Every strand that grows from the follicle contains no melanin, making it fully translucent. The white appearance is an optical effect, light scattering through the keratin structure of the colorless strand. While this process is typically associated with aging, some individuals develop it prematurely due to genetic conditions or autoimmune factors that target melanocytes. In ancient populations, pure white hair was exceedingly rare, and when it appeared naturally with age, it often symbolized wisdom or spiritual power. In biological terms, white hair signifies the final stage of follicular aging. Yet, it also reveals how deeply pigment chemistry and follicle health are connected. Without melanin, the hair becomes more porous, weaker in structure, and less resistant to environmental wear. However, it can also reflect heat more effectively, a potential thermoregulatory benefit in elders who may have been less active in the sun. Hair color evolution by region. Hair color diversity is a relatively recent phenomenon in human history. For most of our species' existence, all humans had black hair. The variations seen today emerged within the last 50,000 years, primarily as small groups migrated into new latitudes and adapted to different levels of ultraviolet radiation. Northern Europe became the epicenter of light hair evolution, while darker tones persisted in equatorial and tropical zones. Intermediate colors developed where populations overlapped and intermarried, blending pigment traits over generations. Genetic studies show that a handful of key genes, MC1R, SLC24A5, OCA2, TYRP1, and KITLG, account for nearly all hair color differences worldwide. Each gene controls either the type of melanin produced or how pigment is distributed through the hair shaft. Environmental selection determined which gene combinations thrived: darker pigments in sun-intense areas to protect the scalp, lighter pigments in dim latitudes to allow better vitamin D synthesis, and mixed tones in temperate zones to balance both. Hair strand variation by ethnicity. Beyond color, the structure of hair strands also evolved under environmental pressure. African hair is typically tightly coiled with a flattened cross-section, optimizing heat dissipation and UV protection. East Asian hair is round and thick, designed for warmth retention and physical resilience. European hair shows the widest variation in both color and texture, from fine and straight to wavy or curly, reflecting centuries of migration and interbreeding between diverse populations. Each structural trait carries subtle adaptive value. Curl patterns regulate temperature and moisture. Strand thickness affects insulation and tensile strength, and pigment density determines how much sunlight the scalp can safely absorb. Together, they form a record of how humans adapted to every possible climate on Earth, encoded not just in skin but in every strand of hair. Ash and silver blonde hair. Ash and silver blonde tones are among the rarest natural shades, defined by a cool, muted undertone that lacks the golden warmth seen in most blonde varieties. This effect is caused by an extremely low level of pheomelanin and a very fine dispersion of eumelanin within the hair shaft. Instead of reflecting yellow light, these strands scatter more blue and gray wavelengths, producing a silvery or smoky hue. Ash blonde hair likely emerged in northern and eastern Europe, where ultraviolet radiation is minimal and sunlight often appears diffused through cloud cover. In these regions, maintaining a neutral tone pigmentation prevented excess light absorption and minimized glare from snow or overcast skies. Structurally, ash blonde hair is among the finest and most translucent, meaning that light can pass through multiple layers of the strand before scattering back, creating the appearance of depth and shimmer. Silver blonde, on the other hand, often appears with early pigment reduction, a mild version of the same process that leads to gray hair. The follicles produce less melanin, while the keratin structure becomes slightly more reflective. In youth, this can manifest as an almost metallic tone that transitions easily into natural silver or white with age. Evolutionarily, these cool hues likely persisted not because of adaptation, but through genetic drift and sexual selection, as rare tones in small populations were perceived as unique and beautiful. Jet black hair. Jet black hair represents the densest concentration of eumelanin found in humans. It absorbs nearly all wavelengths of visible light, giving it a deep, mirror-like sheen. This hair color likely represents the ancestral human state, having evolved in equatorial Africa roughly 200,000 years ago. The intense pigmentation provided two major evolutionary advantages: protection from ultraviolet radiation and regulation of scalp temperature. Melanin in black hair acts as a natural UV filter, preventing damage to hair keratin and the scalp beneath. Its density also enhances heat dissipation. Coiled or tightly curled black hair allows air to circulate near the scalp while shading it from the sun, a structure perfectly suited to tropical climates. Jet black hair is thicker and rounder in cross-section than lighter types, which contributes to its strength, gloss, and resistance to environmental wear. Beyond biology, jet black hair carried powerful social and cultural symbolism in many early societies. It was often associated with vitality, fertility, and strength, the physical embodiment of life force under the blazing sun. Even today, its luminous depth is considered a mark of health and youth across diverse cultures. Mixed and rare variants. Occasionally, genetic recombination creates unique shades that blend properties of multiple hair types. Examples include ash brown, dark strawberry, or golden black tones, which occur when genes controlling melanin balance express unevenly across different follicles. This mosaic of pigment activity produces multidimensional hues that shift subtly in light. Albinism represents the most extreme case of pigment absence. Caused by mutations in genes such as TYR and OCA2, albinism prevents or drastically reduces melanin production in skin, hair, and eyes. Hair in individuals with albinism may appear white, yellowish, or even faintly pink depending on light reflection and underlying vascular tones. Although it provides no UV protection, the condition has persisted across all human populations due to its neutral impact on reproduction in many environments. Historically, people with albinism stood out visually, which could lead to both reverence and misunderstanding in ancient societies. They say blondes have more fun, redheads have more fire, and brunettes have more brains, but really we all just have different amounts of melanin doing its best under the sun. So if your curiosity's growing faster than your hair, hit subscribe. Because every strand on your head has a story, and here, we explain every one of them. Stay curious, because evolution never stopped creating, it just moved into your mirror.